In the spring of 1944, the island of Biak did not look like the center of a storm. From the air, it appeared as a strip of green surrounded by blue, another speck in the vast Pacific. But to American planners, Biak was a prize that could not be ignored. The island sat just off the northern coast of New Guinea, directly along the path General Douglas MacArthur intended to use to push west toward the Philippines. Hidden beneath Biak's jungle canopy were 3 airfields that could bring Allied bombers within range of the Dutch East Indies and beyond. Taking Biak meant tightening the noose around Japan's shrinking empire. What American commanders did not fully grasp was how thoroughly the Japanese had transformed Biak into a fortress. After brutal defeats elsewhere in the Pacific, Japanese doctrine had changed. Instead of defending beaches at the waterline, they dug deep. They carved firing positions into limestone ridges. They blasted tunnels through coral rock. They constructed reinforced bunkers with overlapping fields of fire so that one machine gun could protect another. These were not temporary field positions. They were engineered kill zones designed to bleed an attacker dry. When elements of the U.S. 41st Infantry Division landed on Biak on May 27, 1944, they expected resistance. What they encountered was something far worse. As American troops pushed inland toward the airfields, they entered terrain that seemed to fight back. The jungle was thick, humid, and disorienting. Coral ridges rose sharply, riddled with hidden openings. Machine gun fire erupted from invisible slits in the rock. Mortar rounds fell from positions that could not be seen, let alone targeted. Standard infantry tactics began to falter. Soldiers were trained to locate the enemy, fix their position with suppressing fire, and maneuver to flank. But on Biak, the enemy was often underground. A bunker might appear as nothing more than a shadow in a hillside. As American riflemen advanced, they were suddenly caught in interlocking streams of fire from multiple concealed positions. Attempts to assault these bunkers with grenades frequently failed. The standard fragmentation grenade, designed to spray shrapnel in open space, often detonated harmlessly outside thick logs, sandbags, or coral walls. Even when a grenade landed near an opening, the blast might not penetrate deep enough to neutralize the defenders inside. Casualties mounted quickly. Units that had fought across New Guinea found themselves stalled. Platoons were pinned down for hours, sometimes days, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to devastating fire. Medics crawled through mud and coral dust to reach the wounded. Evacuation was slow and dangerous. Every ridge had to be taken yard by yard. Among the thousands of young Americans on that island was a private from Iowa named Harold Moon. Like many soldiers in the Pacific, he was not a career professional. He had grown up on a farm, accustomed to hard labor, long days, and the discipline of rural life. The Army had trained him to follow orders, to rely on his equipment, and to trust the chain of command. Nothing in that training, however, fully prepared him for the suffocating chaos of bunker warfare. By early June, the fighting around the ridges near the Mokmer airfield had become especially intense. Japanese defenders, under orders to hold at all costs, were deeply entrenched. American patrols reported that entire platoons were being halted by a single, well-positioned bunker. Every attempt to rush the entrances resulted in more wounded men lying exposed under the tropical sun. Officers studied maps and aerial photographs, searching for weaknesses. Artillery was called in, but the limestone absorbed and deflected much of the blast. Airstrikes shook the jungle canopy, but often failed to collapse the deeper tunnels. Infantrymen on the ground began to understand a grim reality. Taking Biak would not be quick, and it would not be clean. It would be a grinding contest of endurance and ingenuity. In this environment, small decisions carried enormous weight. A single soldier's action could determine whether a squad lived or died. The official manuals described how to assault fortified positions, but those manuals had been written in classrooms, far from coral ridges and hidden cave mouths. On Biak, the distance between doctrine and survival grew thinner by the hour. As the Americans pressed forward, frustration simmered. Soldiers knew that every delay gave the Japanese time to reinforce, to reposition, to prepare the next ambush. The mission was clear: seize the airfields and secure the island. But clarity of mission did not erase the fear that crept in when another burst of machine gun fire cut down a friend. Biak became a proving ground not only for weapons and tactics, but for the human capacity to adapt under pressure. It forced young men to confront choices that would follow them long after the smoke cleared. In the shadow of those ridges, where bunkers seemed almost invincible, the stage was set for an act that would challenge the rulebook itself.
By the second week of fighting on Biak, the optimism that had accompanied the landing was gone. What remained was a hard, grinding reality. The Japanese defenders were not launching reckless banzai charges as they had in earlier campaigns. Instead, they waited. Hidden behind coral and timber, they let the Americans come to them. Every ridge concealed another firing slit. Every narrow path could become a killing lane in seconds. American infantry doctrine in 1944 was built around mobility and coordinated firepower. A squad would suppress an enemy position while another element maneuvered to flank it. Artillery and mortars would soften defenses before an assault. Fragmentation grenades would be tossed into trenches or open foxholes to clear the way. On paper, it was a system refined through years of training and earlier battles. On Biak, that system began to unravel. The problem was not courage, it was physics. Japanese bunkers on Biak were often dug into solid limestone, reinforced with heavy logs and layers of sandbags. Many had narrow, angled entrances designed specifically to deflect blast pressure. When a standard Mark II fragmentation grenade detonated outside one of these openings, most of its deadly fragments sprayed outward into the jungle rather than inward into the bunker. The explosion might stun the defenders for a moment, but it rarely destroyed the position. As soon as American troops tried to advance, machine gun fire resumed. Flamethrowers were sometimes used, and when they worked, they were terrifyingly effective. But flamethrower operators were prime targets. They carried bulky fuel tanks on their backs and had to get dangerously close to a bunker's entrance to deliver a burst. Casualty rates among those teams were high. Not every unit had flamethrowers immediately available, and the dense terrain made it difficult to maneuver them into position. Meanwhile, Japanese doctrine emphasized survival inside fortified positions for as long as possible. Soldiers were ordered to hold until death, tying down American units and inflicting maximum casualties. Supplies were stockpiled in tunnels. Communication lines ran underground. Some bunkers were connected through hidden passages, allowing defenders to shift positions without exposing themselves. As American losses increased, pressure mounted on junior officers and enlisted men alike. Every stalled advance meant more wounded lying in exposed ground. Medics worked under constant fire. Riflemen began to question whether the tools they had been issued were enough for the task at hand. Among the equipment distributed to infantry units were white phosphorus grenades. Officially, these grenades were designed for signaling, screening, and marking targets. When detonated, they produced thick white smoke and scattered burning fragments of phosphorus that ignited on contact with air. The canisters were often clearly marked to indicate they were not intended as standard offensive weapons against fortified positions. Their primary purpose was to create smoke screens or mark enemy locations for artillery and aircraft. There were reasons for these restrictions. White phosphorus was unpredictable. It burned at extremely high temperatures and could cause severe, indiscriminate injuries. In open terrain, its smoke was useful for concealment, but in close quarters, especially near friendly troops, it posed serious risks. Commanders were cautious about its employment. Yet on Biak, the battlefield did not conform to neat categories of offensive and support. The line blurred under fire. Soldiers pinned down in front of bunkers were not thinking about doctrinal labels, they were thinking about survival. Private Harold Moon and his fellow infantrymen experienced this tension firsthand. Pinned by accurate machine gun fire, they watched attempts to silence a particular bunker fail again and again. Grenades burst outside the entrance with little effect. Rifle fire chipped coral from the opening, but did not stop the gun inside. Each failed assault meant another man crawling back, wounded or shaken. Time became elastic in those moments. Minutes felt like hours. The air was thick with humidity, cordite, and the sharp smell of explosives. Communication with higher command was limited to shouted orders and runners moving under fire. Decisions had to be made at the lowest levels. Moon had been trained to follow instructions. Every soldier had. Discipline was the backbone of the army. But discipline also required initiative within the commander's intent. Manuals encouraged adaptability, yet they also imposed boundaries. The white phosphorus grenade sat within reach, its intended use clearly defined. The bunker ahead continued to fire. In that narrow space between regulation and reality, the weight of choice settled heavily. Breaking procedure could bring punishment. Failing to act could cost lives. On Biak, those were not abstract possibilities. They were immediate and visible in the wounded being dragged to cover. The Pacific War was forcing rapid evolution in tactics. Lessons learned in one battle were transmitted to the next, but innovation often began not in headquarters, but in the dirt, under fire. It began with individuals confronting problems the manuals had not fully solved. As the firefight dragged on and options dwindled, the question was no longer whether the rulebook applied perfectly to Biak. The question was whether survival demanded something different. In the suffocating heat of that ridge, doctrine faced its ultimate test, not in theory, but in the hands of a single private staring at an enemy bunker that refused to fall silent.
By the time the sun climbed high over the coral ridges of Biak, the firefight had already stretched on for hours. The bunker ahead seemed alive, spitting controlled bursts of machine gun fire that pinned American riflemen behind shallow cover. Every attempt to approach had been met with precision. The entrance was narrow, angled, and partially shielded by rock. Standard grenades had exploded with sharp cracks and flying fragments, but the gun inside always came back to life. Private Harold Moon lay pressed into the dirt, feeling the vibration of each burst through the ground. Around him, men hugged what little protection they could find: tree roots, shallow depressions, scattered coral. A wounded soldier groaned somewhere to his left, unable to move without drawing fire. The situation was static, and in static warfare on Biak, static meant casualties. Moon's squad had already tried the approved methods: rifle fire into the opening, fragmentation grenades tossed as close as possible, coordinated attempts to rush the position. Each effort ended the same way: more Americans forced back, the bunker still intact. The machine gun inside was protected not just by walls of coral and timber, but by design. Japanese engineers had angled the interior to deflect blast and shrapnel, allowing defenders to survive explosions that would have destroyed a less prepared position. In the chaos of the moment, Moon's attention shifted to the equipment at hand. Among the grenades issued to his unit were white phosphorus devices. They were typically used to create smokescreens or mark targets. Their canisters carried warnings about proper use. They were not standard bunker-clearing tools. But Moon understood something critical. White phosphorus did not rely on fragmentation alone. When ignited, it burned intensely and produced thick, choking smoke. In confined spaces, its effects could be overwhelming. The decision did not unfold in dramatic slow motion. It happened in seconds. Moon grabbed a white phosphorus grenade, pulled the pin, and hurled it directly toward the bunker entrance. The canister clattered inside. What followed was different from the sharp crack of a fragmentation blast. A sudden eruption of thick white smoke billowed outward, accompanied by flashes of searing flame. The machine gun inside faltered, then stopped entirely.
Shouts in Japanese echoed briefly from within. The confined space amplified the burning effect, filling the bunker with smoke and heat that could not easily dissipate. Moon did not wait to analyze the result. He signaled his squad forward. Riflemen advanced cautiously, covering the entrance. When they reached the bunker, they found it neutralized. The defenders inside had been incapacitated by the smoke and fire. For the first time that day, the position that had halted their advance was silent. The significance of that moment registered immediately. The method had worked where others had failed, but there was no time for celebration. As the platoon pushed forward, another bunker opened fire from a different angle, part of the interlocking defensive network that made Biak so lethal. Again, the pattern repeated. Suppressive fire pinned the position. Moon moved forward under covering shots. Another white phosphorus grenade arced through the air and disappeared into a dark opening. Again, thick smoke poured out. Again, the firing ceased. Word spread quickly among nearby squads. The tactic was improvised, not formally authorized, but its effectiveness was undeniable. As the day wore on, Moon and his fellow soldiers advanced from one fortified position to the next. Some bunkers required multiple grenades. In a few cases, defenders attempted to fight through the smoke, only to be cut down by covering rifle fire. Each cleared bunker reduced the crossfire that had locked the Americans in place. By late afternoon, the ridge that had seemed impassable in the morning began to fall. Positions that had stalled entire platoons were neutralized one by one. Estimates later suggested that roughly 20 bunkers were cleared in a single day's fighting, many through the use of white phosphorus grenades in close-quarters assaults. The shift in momentum was palpable. Instead of reacting to unseen fire, American troops began to dictate the pace. Machine gun nests that had dominated the terrain were silenced. Paths once considered suicidal to cross became viable routes of advance. Casualties, while still present, no longer mounted at the same devastating rate. Moon's actions were not carried out in isolation. They depended on coordination, riflemen providing suppressive fire, squad leaders directing movement, medics standing ready. But his willingness to use a tool in a way that defied its labeled purpose changed the dynamics of that battlefield sector. In the confined brutality of bunker warfare, effectiveness was measured in lives spared as much as ground taken. Every bunker cleared meant fewer American soldiers exposed to lethal crossfire. Every silent machine gun meant one less obstacle between the division and the airfields they had been ordered to seize. As dusk settled over Biak, smoke still lingered among the ridges. The day had begun with frustration and mounting losses. It ended with a hard-won breakthrough. The rulebook had not predicted exactly how to overcome coral fortifications carved into stone, but on that ridge, adaptation under fire achieved what standard procedure could not. The battle for Biak was far from over. More ridges, more tunnels, and more hidden defenders waited in the jungle. Yet the events of that day demonstrated a harsh truth of war. Survival often belongs to those who can think beyond the page, who can recognize when circumstances demand something different. In the chaos of the moment, one private's split-second decision rippled outward, altering the course of a fight that had seemed unwinnable hours before. In the smoke-filled entrances of those bunkers, the balance between doctrine and necessity tipped decisively toward necessity, and the ridge that had swallowed so many lives finally began to give way.
When the ridge was finally secured, the silence felt almost unnatural. For hours, the air had been torn apart by machine gun bursts, grenade blasts, and shouted commands. Now, there was only drifting smoke and the distant crack of sporadic fighting elsewhere on the island. American troops moved cautiously among the shattered bunker entrances, clearing tunnels, checking for hidden defenders, and counting the cost. Officers began gathering reports almost immediately. On Biak, information moved up the chain of command as quickly as runners and radios allowed. The breakthrough on that sector of the ridge was significant.
A position that had stalled multiple units had fallen in a single day. But as details emerged about how it had happened, reactions were mixed. White phosphorus grenades had been used repeatedly against fortified bunkers. Officially, those grenades were intended for screening and marking, not as primary assault weapons. Their containers carried clear warnings about their role. In training manuals, their function was carefully defined. Yet on that ridge, they had become the decisive tool. For some officers, the results spoke for themselves. The bunkers were neutralized. The line had advanced. Casualties during the breakthrough were lower than in previous failed assaults against similar positions. In the brutal arithmetic of war, effectiveness mattered. For others, the implications were more complicated. White phosphorus was a controversial weapon even then. It ignited on contact with air, burned at extremely high temperatures, and produced thick, choking smoke. In open terrain, it created concealment. In confined spaces, its effects were intensified. Reports described defenders inside bunkers being overwhelmed not only by flame, but by suffocating fumes and disorientation. Questions surfaced quietly at first. Had established protocols been violated? Had a line been crossed? Or had the realities of Biak exposed a gap between doctrine and battlefield necessity? The Pacific War had already forced rapid tactical evolution. Earlier in the conflict, American forces had suffered heavy losses attacking well-prepared Japanese positions head-on. Over time, they adapted. Flamethrowers became more common in assault units. Engineers developed demolition charges specifically for bunker clearing. Infantry coordination improved. But adaptation often lagged behind immediate need. What happened on that ridge was not the result of a new weapon being invented. It was the result of a weapon being used differently. That distinction mattered. Innovation in war rarely arrives neatly packaged. More often, it emerges from individuals confronting immediate danger and choosing to act. As after-action reports were compiled, commanders compared casualty figures. In earlier attempts to take similar fortified positions on Biak, units had suffered significant losses with minimal gain. On the day the phosphorus grenades were employed aggressively, the ridge fell and the advance resumed. Estimates later suggested that hundreds of American soldiers who might have been exposed to prolonged crossfire were spared as a direct result of the accelerated breakthrough. Those numbers carried weight. Every saved life meant a soldier who would not be listed as killed or wounded. It meant one less telegram sent home. In that context, tactical flexibility became harder to dismiss. Yet the ethical dimension lingered. War in the Pacific was already marked by extreme brutality. Japanese forces often fought to the death, rarely surrendering. American troops, hardened by previous campaigns, responded with increasing intensity. The environment fostered a cycle of escalation. Within that atmosphere, the use of white phosphorus in confined bunkers symbolized a broader shift toward whatever measures were necessary to overcome entrenched resistance. At higher levels of command, the lesson was studied pragmatically. Bunker warfare required specialized solutions. Fragmentation alone was insufficient against reinforced enclosed positions. Smoke and flame, when applied carefully and in coordination with infantry movement, could neutralize defenders more effectively. Over time, bunker clearing tactics across the Pacific Theater increasingly emphasized combined arms, rifle suppression, flamethrowers, demolition charges, and, when available, smoke-producing munitions used aggressively. Private Moon did not draft new doctrine. He did not issue formal recommendations, but his actions illustrated a gap between the assumptions of training and the realities of coral ridges carved into fortresses. In war, such gaps are often closed not by committees, but by experience under fire. Within his unit, the reaction was simpler. Men who had been pinned down that morning were alive at dusk. They understood what had changed. Among enlisted soldiers, effectiveness carried its own authority. Respect was earned in moments when hesitation could mean death. Moon's willingness to act decisively under pressure did not go unnoticed. The battle for Biak continued for weeks. Japanese defenders retreated into deeper cave systems, prolonging the fight even after the airfields were secured.
Casualties on both sides remained heavy, but the breakthrough on that ridge marked a turning point in that sector. Momentum, once stalled, had shifted. War compresses moral and tactical dilemmas into seconds. Decisions that would be debated in safety for years are made in the span of a heartbeat. On Biak, the choice to use a grenade labeled for one purpose in a radically different way reflected a broader truth. Survival often demands adaptation beyond the printing page. In the aftermath, there was no grand announcement, no immediate rewriting of manuals. Instead, there was quiet acknowledgement that the battlefield had once again forced evolution. The ridge stood as evidence that rigid adherence to doctrine could falter against innovative defense, and that sometimes the difference between failure and success lay in the courage to reinterpret the tools already in hand.
When the battle for Biak finally began to wind down in late summer 1944, the island looked nothing like the tropical outpost American planners had once studied on maps. The jungle was scarred by artillery craters. Coral ridges were blasted open, their hidden tunnels exposed. The 3 airfields that had justified the invasion were operational, launching Allied aircraft deeper into Japanese-held territory. Strategically, the objective had been achieved. Tactically, the cost had been severe. For the men who fought there, the victory was measured less in captured runways and more in survival. Units that landed at near full strength left with long casualty lists. Some soldiers were evacuated with wounds that would mark them for life. Others carried memories that would never fully fade. Among them was Private Harold Moon, a young infantryman who had arrived as one face among thousands and left as someone quietly remembered for a single decisive day. There were no dramatic ceremonies on the ridge where the bunkers had fallen. War rarely pauses for reflection in the moment. Recognition, when it came, moved through paperwork, recommendations, and after-action summaries. What mattered first was the continuation of the campaign. Biak was one step in a much larger advance across the Pacific, part of a strategy aimed at isolating Japanese forces and paving the way toward the Philippines and eventually Japan itself. Yet within his unit, the story endured. Soldiers talk. They remember who froze and who moved forward. They remember who followed the book and who rewrote it under fire. In Biak, many remembered the private who had grabbed a white phosphorus grenade when nothing else was working. The number often repeated in later accounts was striking. Hundreds of lives potentially spared because the advance had resumed that day instead of stalling for another costly assault. Whether the exact figure was 500, 600, or closer to 700, the broader truth remained. Every bunker cleared reduced exposure to interlocking fire. Every minute shaved off the assault meant fewer men crossing open ground under machine guns. But legacy in war is rarely simple. The same act that saved friendly lives also reflected the harsh escalation of Pacific combat. Bunker warfare left little room for half measures. Japanese defenders, ordered to hold to the death, transformed islands into labyrinths of resistance. American troops responded with flamethrowers, demolition charges, tanks modified with bulldozer blades, and increasingly aggressive use of smoke and incendiary munitions. The Pacific became a testing ground for the limits of human endurance and the elasticity of military doctrine. Harold Moon was not a general shaping grand strategy. He was a farm boy from Iowa who had learned to work long hours in open fields, far from coral ridges and hidden machine guns. His decision on Biak did not come from theoretical debate. It came from immediate necessity. Men were pinned down. Standard methods were failing. He used what he had. After the war, many veterans returned to lives that contrasted sharply with the violence they had witnessed. Farms were replanted, factories resumed peacetime production. Families tried to bridge the gap between who their sons had been before the war and who they were afterward.
For countless veterans, including those from Biak, the most intense moments of their youth were compressed into stories told sparingly, if at all. History often highlights sweeping campaigns and famous commanders. Names like MacArthur dominate textbooks, but wars are also shaped by smaller, localized decisions, by corporals and privates responding to conditions no planner could perfectly anticipate. The Pacific Theater, with its caves and coral fortresses, forced adaptation at every level. Over time, bunker-clearing tactics became more refined. Units were trained specifically for assaulting fortified cave systems. Combined arms coordination improved. The brutal lessons of places like Biak informed operations on Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Innovation, once improvised under fire, gradually became standard practice. The story of that day on the ridge survives not because it rewrote the entire war, but because it captures something essential about combat. Rules exist for order and discipline. They provide structure in chaos, but battlefields are unpredictable. When doctrine collides with reality, survival may depend on the courage to adapt. For the men who advanced behind him, Moon's choice was not an abstract debate about policy. It was the difference between remaining pinned down in a kill zone and moving forward. It was the difference between another failed assault and a breakthrough. In the end, Biak became another secured point on the Allied map of the Pacific. Aircraft took off from its runways, striking deeper targets and tightening strategic pressure. The island's name faded from headlines as the war moved westward. Yet within the smoke-filled mouths of its bunkers, a quiet example was set, one that reflected both the ingenuity and the severity of the conflict. War often demands decisions in seconds that echo for decades. On one ridge in 1944, a private faced such a moment. He chose action over hesitation, adaptation over rigid adherence. The consequences were immediate, tangible, and measured in lives. And long after the gunfire stopped, that is how many remembered it. Not simply as an act of defiance, but as proof that in the chaos of war, survival sometimes belongs to those willing to think differently when it matters most.